I had always considered my life stable, predictable, even comfortable in its monotony. That's how I liked it. Sarah and I had been married for 7 years, living in a quaint suburban neighborhood just outside Austin. Our house, a cozy two-bedroom with a white picket fence, was the picture of simplicity, a place we imagined raising a family someday. We had a dog, Charlie, whose barks marked the rhythm of our daily lives. Everything about our world was ordinary, safe. Or so I thought. The first cracks in that facade were subtle, barely noticeable. Sarah's phone, which used to sit on the kitchen counter or the bedside table, became a permanent fixture in her hand. She'd swipe through messages quickly, her screen tilted away from me, offering only vague explanations when I asked about her sudden attachment to it. "Just work stuff," she'd say with a dismissive wave. Sarah was a freelance graphic designer, her hours flexible and her workload sporadic. It wasn't unusual for her to have a flurry of activity one week and almost nothing the next. I didn't think much of it at first. But then, her laughter, once so freely shared with me, became quieter, more reserved, as if she were carrying a secret. Then came David. My older brother David was everything I wasn't. Charming, extroverted, the kind of man who could walk into a room and own it without even trying. At 40, he still had the energy and charisma that made people gravitate toward him. He'd been through a rough divorce a year earlier and had asked if he could stay with us for a few weeks while he got back on his feet. Sarah and I agreed without hesitation. After all, he was family. At first, it was fine. David's presence added a new dynamic to our household. He'd joke with Sarah, play fetch with Charlie, and fill the house with his larger-than-life personality. I'd always been close to my brother, and it felt good to have him around again. But as the weeks passed, I began to notice things that didn't sit right. David's flirtatious nature was nothing new. He'd always been that way. But his interactions with Sarah seemed different. A shared laugh that lingered too long, an inside joke that I wasn't part of, a casual touch on her shoulder that felt too familiar. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was being paranoid. But the knot in my stomach didn't loosen. One night, I woke up to find Sarah's side of the bed empty. The clock read 1:12 a.m. I figured she'd gone to the kitchen for a snack or to check on Charlie. But when I went downstairs, I found her in the living room with David. They were sitting on the couch, their heads close as they spoke in hushed tones. When they saw me, the conversation stopped abruptly. "Couldn't sleep," Sarah said quickly, tucking her hair behind her ear. David leaned back, his trademark grin firmly in place. "Me neither. We were just talking," he said. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Sarah said, her tone a little too bright. "Go back to bed. I'll be up in a minute." I hesitated but eventually went back upstairs. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Over the next few weeks, the unease grew. Sarah and David seemed to be spending more time together. They'd laugh at jokes I didn't understand, exchange glances that felt too loaded with meaning. When I brought it up to Sarah, she brushed it off with a laugh. "David's your brother," she said. "Don't be ridiculous." Her dismissal stung, but I didn't push it. I didn't want to be the jealous husband, the guy who saw problems where there weren't any. But the knot in my stomach wouldn't go away. The turning point came on a Saturday afternoon. Sarah had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she went to take a shower. I'd never gone through her phone before. We'd always trusted each other. But something in me, that gnawing sense of unease, drove me to pick it up. Her messages were innocuous at first, filled with conversations with friends and clients. But then I saw a thread labeled D. My heart pounded as I opened it. The messages weren't explicit, but they were damning all the same. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." He's starting to notice. "We need to be careful. Don't worry. I'll handle it." My hands shook as I read and reread the texts, my brain struggling to process what they meant. My wife. My brother. How could they? I put the phone back on the counter just as Sarah came downstairs, a towel wrapped around her hair. She smiled at me, completely unaware of the storm raging inside me. "What's wrong?" she asked, noticing my expression. "Nothing," I said, forcing a smile. "Nothing at all." But deep down, I knew my life would never be the same. The weight of what I'd uncovered sat heavily on my chest, suffocating me in silence. Days turned into a blur of forced smiles and half-hearted conversations. Sarah moved through our home with the same practiced ease as always, unaware that I'd glimpsed the truth. And David acted as if nothing had changed, his charm as disarming as ever, though now every laugh, every casual gesture felt like a slap in the face. I couldn't bring myself to confront them, not yet. I needed to be sure to have more than just a few messages. The idea of accusing them without undeniable proof left a bitter taste in my mouth. So, I watched. I waited. And every day, my anger simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. Sarah's behavior became more guarded. Her phone, once carelessly left around the house, was now glued to her side. She'd laugh at texts she didn't share with me, her smile tinged with a nervous edge. David's presence, once comforting, now felt like an unwelcome intrusion. I found myself avoiding him, his easygoing demeanor only fueling my resentment. One night, unable to sleep, I wandered downstairs. The house was dark, save for the faint glow of the living room TV. I stopped in my tracks when I heard voices. Sarah and David, their tones hushed but unmistakable. "He's been distant lately," Sarah said, her voice carrying a hint of worry. "You're imagining things," David replied. "Mark's always been like that, overthinking everything." "I don't know," she murmured. "It's like he knows something." "He doesn't," David said confidently. "Trust me. If he did, we'd know." I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms as their words echoed in my head. I wanted to storm into the room, to demand answers, but I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I crept back upstairs, my heart pounding as I replayed their conversation over and over. The next day, I called Eric, my best friend since college. He was the only person I trusted to give me honest advice. We met at a diner on the edge of town, a quiet place where we could talk without being overheard. Eric listened as I laid everything out, his expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Mark," he said finally, "you need to confront this. You can't let it fester." "What if I'm wrong?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What if I'm just being paranoid?" "You're not," he said firmly. "But if you need more proof, get it. Don't let them gaslight you." That night, after Sarah went to bed, I installed a small app on her phone while it charged on the nightstand. It allowed me to see her messages, her call logs, even her location. The act felt dirty, invasive, but I couldn't see another way forward. The following days were agonizing. Every time my phone pinged with an alert, my stomach twisted in knots. Most of her messages were innocent, mundane exchanges with friends or clients. But then there were the ones from David. "Can't wait to see you tonight. He's been acting weird. Be careful. Don't worry. We'll figure it out." Each message was another crack in the foundation of my world. I began piecing together a timeline, tracing their deceit back to the moment David moved in. It all made sense now. The late-night conversations, the shared laughter, the growing distance between Sarah and me. One evening, I found myself parked a few blocks away from our house, watching as Sarah and David stepped out onto the porch. They didn't touch, but the way they looked at each other spoke volumes. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white as I fought the urge to confront them then and there. Instead, I waited. I needed one final piece of evidence, something they couldn't deny. So I bought a small, discreet camera and set it up in the living room. It was hidden among the books on the shelf, angled perfectly to capture their late-night rendezvous. The first few nights yielded nothing. They were careful, their conversations low and their movements subtle. But on the fourth night, as I reviewed the footage, I found what I was looking for. The way Sarah leaned into David, her hand brushing his arm. The way he looked at her, his expression far too intimate for a brother-in-law. My chest tightened as I watched, my worst fears playing out on the screen before me. There was no denying it now. I had the proof I needed. But as I sat there, the weight of their betrayal threatening to crush me, one question lingered in my mind. What was I going to do about it? The next morning, I woke with a clarity that surprised me. The footage I had seen the night before was burned into my mind, replaying in an endless loop. Their laughter, their closeness, their betrayal. It was undeniable. Yet, even with all the evidence, I felt paralyzed. Anger simmered beneath the surface, but a part of me feared what would happen if I let it boil over. I spent most of the day avoiding them. Sarah had gone to meet a client, and David was out at the gym. The house was eerily quiet, giving me space to think. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I needed to confront them, to force them to face the wreckage they had caused. By the time Sarah returned, I had made my decision. She walked into the kitchen, her smile faltering when she saw me sitting at the table, a cup of coffee untouched in front of me. The weight of my gaze must have given me away. "Mark, is everything okay?" she asked, her tone cautious. I gestured for her to sit. She hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly, but eventually lowered herself into the chair across from me. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. "I need to ask you something," I began, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "And I want you to be honest with me." Her eyes darted to the side, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. "Of course," she said, though her tone betrayed her unease. "Is there something going on between you and David?" I asked bluntly. Her reaction was immediate. Her eyes widened, her face flushing as she sputtered. "What? No, of course not. How could you even think that?" I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "Don't lie to me, Sarah. I've seen the messages. I've seen the way you two act around each other." "I know." Her mouth opened and closed, her words caught somewhere between denial and panic. "Mark, it's not what you think," she finally said, her voice trembling. "Then what is it?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like my wife and my brother have been sneaking around behind my back." Tears welled in her eyes, and she shook her head. "It was a mistake," she whispered. "It was never supposed to happen." I felt the air leave my lungs, the confirmation hitting me like a punch to the gut. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely audible. She hesitated, her hands trembling. "A few months," she admitted. "It started after he moved in. I was lonely, and you were so busy with work. I didn't mean for it to go this far." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "So this is my fault? Because I was working to provide for us? That's your excuse?" "No," she said quickly. "I'm not blaming you, Mark. I take full responsibility. I made a terrible mistake, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." Before I could respond, the front door opened, and David walked in. He stopped in his tracks when he saw us, his gym bag slung over his shoulder. His expression shifted from surprise to caution as he took in the scene. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. I stood, my fists clenched at my sides. "Why don't you tell me, David? Or should I say, why don't you tell me what's been going on between you and my wife?" David's eyes flicked to Sarah, then back to me. He sighed, setting his bag down. "Mark, Save it," I snapped. "I already know. I just want to hear you say it." He ran a hand through his hair, his usual confidence replaced with something resembling guilt. "Yes," he admitted. "It happened. And I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you." "Never meant to hurt me?" I repeated, my voice shaking with anger. "You slept with my wife, David. How the hell do you think that wouldn't hurt me?" "I don't have an excuse," he said quietly. "I was going through a rough time, and I let things get out of hand. It was wrong, and I'll regret it forever." "Good," I said, my tone icy. "You should regret it. Both of you should." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah wiped at her tears, her shoulders shaking as she tried to compose herself. David stood there, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. And me? I felt hollow, as if the anger and betrayal had burned through everything inside me, leaving nothing but ash. "I want you out," I said finally, looking directly at David. "Pack your things and get out of my house. Tonight." He nodded, not arguing, and turned to leave the room. Sarah reached out to me, her voice breaking as she said, "Mark, please. I know I don't deserve it, but I want to fix this. I want to fix us." I stepped back, her touch feeling like fire against my skin. "I don't know if that's possible," I said, my voice cold and distant. "Right now, I just need you to stay away from me." She nodded, her tears falling freely as I turned and walked out of the room. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. The life I thought I had was gone, shattered beyond recognition. The days following the confrontation were a haze of raw emotion and deafening silence. David left that same evening, his belongings hastily packed into the trunk of his car. I didn't watch him go. I couldn't bring myself to. The sight of his back as he walked out of my home, our home, was more than I could bear. Sarah stayed. Though our conversations were reduced to perfunctory exchanges, her every word laced with regret and desperation to make amends. I could barely look at her. I spent most nights on the couch, staring blankly at the ceiling or at the muted TV. Sleep was elusive. When I closed my eyes, I saw them, Sarah and David, laughing together, leaning too close, their betrayal playing on a loop in my mind. The anger and pain were unrelenting, a storm that refused to pass. Even Charlie, sensing the tension in the house, stayed close to me, his quiet presence a small comfort in the chaos. Sarah's attempts to reach out fell hollow. She'd leave notes on the kitchen counter, apologizing yet again, begging for a chance to talk. Her words blurred together in my mind, their meaning lost under the weight of what she'd done. I avoided her as much as I could, retreating to the garage or going for long drives with no destination in mind. Anything to escape the suffocating atmosphere of our fractured home. It was during one of these drives that I found myself parked at a lookout point just outside of town. The city lights stretched out before me, a stark contrast to the darkness that seemed to engulf my life. I pulled out my phone and dialed Eric's number. He answered on the second ring. "Mark," he said, his voice heavy with concern. "How are you holding up?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I feel lost, angry, numb, all at once." "That's normal," he said gently. "What they did, it's unforgivable. But you don't have to figure everything out right now. Take it one day at a time." "I don't even know where to start," I confessed. "Everywhere I look, I see them. This house, this town, it's all tainted." Eric was silent for a moment before he spoke. "Maybe it's time for a change. A fresh start. Have you thought about getting away? Even just for a little while?" The idea lingered in my mind long after we ended the call. A fresh start. It sounded appealing, almost impossible. But as the days dragged on, the idea took root. I began to research job openings in other cities, places far from the suffocating reminders of what I'd lost. It felt like an escape, yes, but also a chance to rebuild. Meanwhile, Sarah's persistence grew. She cornered me in the kitchen one morning, her eyes red from crying. "Mark, please," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I've hurt you more than I can ever make up for. But I love you. I want to fix this to fix us. Tell me what I can do." I stared at her, my chest tightening with a mix of anger and sorrow. "I don't know if you can," I said honestly. "Every time I look at you, all I see is what you've done. How do we come back from that?" She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Her tears fell freely as she whispered, "I'm not giving up on us, Mark. I'll do whatever it takes." Her words echoed in my mind as I packed my things that evening. I didn't tell her where I was going, only that I needed space. The truth was, I didn't know where I was going either. I just knew I couldn't stay. I drove aimlessly for hours, eventually stopping at a motel off the highway. The room was small and unremarkable, but it was quiet, a sanctuary away from the chaos of my life. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. Over the next few days, I began to piece together a plan. I applied for jobs in cities I'd never visited, places where no one knew my name or my story. I found comfort in the anonymity, in the possibility of starting over. And as the interviews started coming in, I felt a flicker of hope, a faint but persistent light in the darkness. Then one evening, I received a call from David. I almost didn't answer, my thumb hovering over the decline button. But curiosity and anger won out, and I pressed accept. "Mark," he said, his voice cautious. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to say this." "You have nothing to say that I want to hear," I snapped. "I know," he said quickly. "But please just let me apologize. What I did was unforgivable. I've lost my brother, and it's tearing me apart. You should have thought about that before you slept with my wife," I said coldly. I know, he repeated, his voice breaking. I know, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I wanted you to hear it from me. I'm sorry, Mark. Truly. I ended the call without another word, my chest heaving with the weight of his apology. It didn't change anything. It didn't erase the betrayal or the pain. But for the first time, I felt like I could let go of the anger just a little. In the weeks that followed, things began to shift. I accepted a job offer in Portland, a city far removed from the life I'd known. I sold the house, packed up what little I wanted to take with me, and left the rest behind. Sarah pleaded with me to reconsider, but I'd made up my mind. This was my chance to start over, to rebuild my life on my own terms. Portland was everything I needed it to be. The city's vibrancy, its constant hum of activity, gave me a sense of renewal. I found an apartment downtown, a small but cozy space that felt like mine. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. I adopted a dog from a local shelter, a scruffy mutt named Max, who quickly became my constant companion. I joined a hiking group, explored the city's coffee shops and bookstores, and slowly began to rediscover who I was outside of my marriage. One evening, as I sat on my balcony overlooking the city, I thought about Sarah and David. The anger was still there, but it had dulled, replaced by something quieter. Acceptance, perhaps. They were a part of my story, but they didn't define it. I had a new chapter to write, one that was entirely my own. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I was ready to turn the page. The first weeks in Portland were a mix of relief and disorientation. It felt surreal to wake up in a place where no one knew my name, where every street and coffee shop was unfamiliar. But there was freedom in that anonymity, a chance to start over without the weight of the past dragging me down. My new job kept me busy, a welcome distraction from the chaos I'd left behind. The team was small but friendly, and the work was challenging in a way that reignited a passion I hadn't realized I'd lost. For the first time in years, I felt like I was building something, not just professionally, but personally. Max, my scruffy mutt, quickly became my closest companion. He was a source of constant comfort, his wagging tail and goofy antics pulling me out of my darkest moments. We spent weekends exploring Portland's parks and hiking trails, the fresh air and open spaces helping me clear my mind. Still, there were nights when the memories crept in. Lying awake in my new apartment, I'd replay the events that had brought me here. The betrayal, the confrontation, the aftermath. Sometimes I'd catch myself wondering if I could have done something differently, if there was a version of my life where things hadn't fallen apart. But those thoughts were fleeting, quickly replaced by the realization that I couldn't change the past. All I could do was move forward. A few months after the move, I received an email from Sarah. Seeing her name in my inbox was like a punch to the gut, the pain sharp and unexpected. I hesitated before opening it, my finger hovering over the delete button. But curiosity got the better of me. The email was short, almost painfully so. Mark, I hope you're doing well. I've started therapy, trying to understand the choices I made and how I hurt you. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I'm working on myself. I'm truly sorry for everything. You deserved better. Sarah. I stared at the screen, rereading her words until they blurred together. A part of me wanted to respond, to tell her exactly how much damage she'd caused. But another part of me, the part that had been slowly learning to let go, knew it wouldn't change anything. Her apology didn't erase the pain, but it wasn't meant to. It was for her, not for me. I closed the email without replying. Life in Portland continued to unfold in unexpected ways. One evening, while browsing a local bookstore, I met someone. Her name was Claire. She was warm and witty, with an easy laugh that seemed to light up the room. We bonded over our shared love of mystery novels and terrible puns, and before I knew it, we were exchanging numbers. Our first date was simple: coffee and a walk along the waterfront. We talked for hours, the conversation flowing effortlessly. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a spark of hope. Claire didn't pry into my past, but she listened when I chose to share. She didn't judge, didn't offer empty platitudes. She just understood. As our relationship grew, so did my confidence. Claire reminded me that I was more than the man who'd been betrayed, more than the pain and anger I'd carried for so long. With her, I felt seen in a way I hadn't in years. One evening, as we sat on my balcony watching the city lights, Claire turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about going back?" she asked. "To Texas?" I shook my head. "Not really. There's nothing left for me there." She nodded, her hand resting on mine. "I just meant, do you think you'll ever feel like you've fully moved on?" Her question lingered in the air, heavy with possibility. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I think I'm getting there. One step at a time." Claire smiled, squeezing my hand. "That's all you can do." As the months turned into a year, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. The pain and betrayal that had once defined me now felt like a distant memory, a chapter in a story that no longer consumed me. I'd built a new life, one filled with purpose and connection. And while the scars of the past remained, they no longer held me back. On the anniversary of my move to Portland, I stood on the balcony with Max at my side, the city spread out before us. The lights twinkled like stars, a reminder of the endless possibilities that lay ahead. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. I thought about Sarah and David, about the life I'd left behind. There was no anger now, only a quiet acceptance. They were a part of my story, but they didn't define it. I had taken the pain they'd caused and turned it into something new, something beautiful. As the cool night air brushed against my skin, I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. The future stretched out before me, uncertain but filled with promise. And for the first time, I felt ready to embrace it. Whatever came next, I knew I'd face it with strength and resilience. Because I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living,